Very warm welcome on behalf of the Institute for International Affairs and Notre Europe Institut Jacques Delors on this webinar on strategic autonomy in the post-COVID world from an Italian and French perspective. I must say that I'm extremely happy for this webinar today, which is really the product and the opportunity that we have in IAI and Institut Jacques Delors to really present to you the findings of a project that we've been working on over the last year that has really been looking at the theme of European strategic autonomy, particularly as it relates to questions of international trade. Now, before I begin, a very, very warm thanks to, in a sense, the two guides and father figures of this project, Pascal Lamy and Piercarlo Padoan. Thank you for your guidance, and we, I think, all really look forward also to your thoughts today. But also a very warm thanks to those that have been sort of working day in, day out on this project. Sort of very warm thanks to Sylvie Berman, to Elvire Fabry from Institut Jacques Delors, and of course Paolo Guerrieri and Fabrizio Botti here in the Institute in Milan. Just a couple of words before I then give the floor to those that are far more competent than me on this particular subject. But given that I worked on the theme of strategic autonomy quite a lot over the last years, just a couple of reflections really. I think what's interesting about this notion is that it really started as a concept that emerged in the area of security and defense. And it did so essentially at a time in which, as Europeans, we started opening our eyes to the reality that we had to take greater care for our own security, including our own defense, given not only that we were surrounded by crises, by conflicts all around us, but that those that had traditionally been sort of taking care of our security, namely the United States of America, there was a growing question mark as to, and particularly obviously this was taking place at the time of the election of Donald Trump, but there was a growing question mark as to the reliability of whether the United States will continue looking after our protection. Now, what's I think been very interesting over the last years is that we have seen this notion of strategic autonomy being extended, being pulled and pushed in a sense in different directions. So it started being applied to the fields of energy, of climate, of digital, of industry, of trade, investment. And for the simple monetary policy, and for the simple reason that, of course, the international context was fundamentally changing. And whereas once upon a time we lived in a world in which we were simply concerned about how we could best promote our norms and our values and our interests, we increasingly came to realize that actually what we also had to worry about is how to protect those norms and values and interests. And we had to protect them, on the one hand, because there was no one, or there was a growing question mark as to whether there was someone protecting them for us, but also because we increasingly came to terms with the reality that there were other international actors that were, in a sense, adversaries, competitors, perhaps even enemies, that were trying to interfere in those internal systems, those interests, those norms, and those values that constitute the European Union. Now, of course, this agenda about protection, mind you, I think there are sort of interesting parallels between the European agenda for strategic autonomy and when President Joe Biden talks about a foreign policy for the middle class. I mean, I think these two notions actually speak to one another quite a lot. And I think personally that it is an agenda that as Europeans, we don't have a choice, we simply have to pursue it. But whereas I think an agenda of protection is of fundamental importance, there is of course the risk that protection does not then simply spill in to protectionism and closure, which of course would really sort of harm the very essence of what the European project is all about. And I think it's a narrow road that we have to sort of walk along, but I think it's a necessary one that we have to pursue. Anyway, so enough from me, and really to sort of, as I said, give the floor to those that are far more knowledgeable and interesting than I am, and of course, no better place to start than with Pascal Lamy, President.
Thanks, Nathalie. Hello, everybody. And thanks for inviting me to kick off these discussions with a few contextual remarks. Starting where you started, Nathalie, which is this concept of open strategic autonomy, which, to be very frank, I still find a bit fuzzy. Borrowed to the geostrategic vocabulary for a European Union who is many things but a geostrategic entity. It's a sort of a typical oxymoron-like Euro pudding speak, meaning different things to different people, but it floats, and it has started inspiring a number of EU policies. It's a sort of a geopolitical halo, which again, in the case of the EU, may not be the best concept, but within the geopolitical halo, there is a geo-economic something, a sort of core, a sort of kern, which is why my own translation of open strategic autonomy is more economic security. Because at the end of the day, when you look at how this works and how it can work as the EU is today, it's more about economic security or even resilience, to use a very fashionable term. As you've said, this is the process, this is the result of a rather long evolution. Four shaping factors, in my view. One, the simple consideration that the crises which have been damaging the European Union, its economy, its society, for the last 15 years have all come from abroad. Financial crisis, the migrants, Ukraine, COVID, all this comes from abroad, damages, hence raising, as you rightly said, the sort of sense that the EU is not protected enough. It is too vulnerable to negative elements coming from the outside. That's number one. Number two, of course, the US-China rivalry, which Sylvie Bernard and Paolo Guerrieri will discuss. And that's, of course, creates a specific situation for the European Union, which I don't have time to dwell on, but we have to find our way somewhere between, although not aligned, for China, of course, with the US to some extent, and trying to not to be caught in any sort of damaging crossfire. The third element, which sometimes we forget, is the fact that the EU has and intends to keep a leadership in climate action, which gives to the EU policy, both within and without the EU and without outside the EU, a sense that this necessitates to grow its capacity remember that the EU on this planet is a rather strange animal. If you compare the world footprint of big economies to their carbon footprint, the EU is the only one where the carbon footprint is smaller than the economic footprint. The ratio between CO2 emissions and the size of its economy worldwide is 0.85% for the EU, 1.5% for US, to 1.5 for US, 2 for India, and 3 for China. So we have a specificity there. And finally, of course, COVID, because of the fragility of some supply chains, and because of the fact that sovereigns are now back big way in economies, and this also translates at the EU level. Now, this leads the EU to activate different policy instruments, the importance of which is decreasing with the federalization of the EU policies. Of course, trade, largest market, totally integrated, at least policy-wise on the external side, and a clearly more assertive trade policy. And this started 5 years ago, but this will be detailed later in our discussion. Number 2, regulation, which is a big power in many ways, which the EU has, as we've seen with the example of the RGPD. The Institut Jacques Delors in Brussels has just written recently a piece on how to use the EU regulatory capacity in imposing conformity on the trade side. Third element of policy, research and development and innovation, where the EU has been moving to reoccupy what we have left for some time, a bit of the frontier of technology. And this is clear in the Horizon Europe new program, and notably with the missions which are more top-down allocation of EU funding, a bit like what other major powers do. And finally, and which is more recent, industrial policy, which is a word which has regained some credence in Brussels after years of being banned. A rather permanent French attitude, as you know, as well as an Italian one, by the way, I remember that. A Dutch, a German anchor that shifted recently with the Altmaier/Merkel stance, and now something which is more active in some sectors, batteries, semiconductors, space launch, and so on. This new IPCEI instruments, where you have a specific regime of state aids and EU funding, so a number of instruments. Trade, of course, remains the number one, whether offensive or defensive. And I think, Nathalie, you've rightly attracted some attention on the border between protection and protectionism, which is what I call precautionism. Protectionism is when you protect your people. Precautionism is when you protect your people from risks. Protectionism is when you protect your producers from foreign competition. There is a gray zone between the two, but it's true that the EU has been growing and is growing its defensive arsenal quite rapidly. Trade defense instrument, anti-dumping, anti-subsidy, this new anti-subsidy competition tool, not trade tool, but competition tool, the anti-coercion instrument, which is being prepared by DG Trade, and notably to try and address the problem of extraterritorial sanctions. And the three sisters, Jacques Delors in Paris, Berlin, and Brussels, as you know, have published a sort of menu of options according to which the EU could be less vulnerable to extraterritorial sanctions, investment screening, export controls, public procurement, and last but not least, this famous CBAM, which is not the name of a new orchestra instrument, but of a carbon border adjustment, which the EU will table mid-July, and the Brussels incarnation of the Institut Jacques Delors will soon publish a new piece of the template which we crafted last year. Final word on where does this take us? In my view, the road to EU strategic autonomy, or let's say more concretely, economic resilience, will be rather long and bumpy for a number of reasons. First, there are differences between member states, the culture of which, the attitude of which, the fears of which are different, and notably between North and South and East and West. And again, once more, I think the French Republic and the Italian Republic sit on the same bench. Differences inside the Commission. It's no secret that between these two couples, Vestager, Dombrovskis on the one side, and Breton, Gentiloni on the other side, there are more than nuances. And by the way, hey, surprise, surprise, Breton and Gentiloni are sitting on the same bench, and Vestager and Dombrovskis on the same bench. Third reason why it's probably going to be long and bumpy is that there is, in this area of industrial policy, in reality, a competition between member states, notably to host new production facilities, and notably on the tech sector. What Breton is doing, chasing large worldwide semiconductors to put plants in Europe is an evidence of that. And finally, and we are back where you started, Nathalie, a more difficult number of choices when geoeconomics and geopolitics conflate. The EU roughly is and will remain, as it integrates, a good, solid actor on geoeconomics. When geopolitics interfere, it sometimes is more of a problem. Just look at the mess we had at the UCO yesterday on Russia to see that there inevitably will be some inherent limits for some time on the road of Europe to open strategic autonomy. Thanks for your attention. Over to you, Alan, I presume.
Thank you very much, Pascal. I'm Alan Beattie. I'm the senior trade writer at the Financial Times in Brussels. I was intrigued, by the way, to hear you give the term its form title, or its form title as used in Brussels, which is open strategic autonomy and not just strategic autonomy. Those of you who follow these theological debates will know that there is a lively argument about whether the term open even belongs in there, which shows you, I think, how uncertain the term is and how uncertain the concept is. So we move now to a roundtable in which we'll hear 4 experts present papers on different aspects of strategic autonomy, or open strategic autonomy. Then we'll have some discussants talk about the papers, and we'll have some Q&A from the audience, and finally our final speaker, Jacopo Paduan. As I say, there will be Q&A at the end of this. Please submit any questions you have on what you've just heard or what you're about to hear via the Q&A function on Zoom. So the first set of papers we'll hear is from Sylvie Berman, former French ambassador and member of the board of directors at the Institut Jacques Delors, and Paolo Guerrieri, a scientist.
Thank you very much. I think this difference between geoeconomics and geopolitics is very interesting. At the same time, it's more or less the same, because China started as a geoeconomics power, and so did the EU. Of course, it's different because China is a state now, and it's easier to develop some military instruments. And that was not the tradition of the EU. And I remembered when we started because I was ambassador to the PSC when we started to discuss European defense. Well, the militaries decided to have their uniforms in Brussels to show that the EU was a real geopolitics or military entity. Well, for the time being, it is not really, and we should use the instruments we have to be stronger. It's obvious now, it should have been even before the pandemic, that the China-US rivalry will be the defining framework of the coming years. And of course, it's a kind of Thucydides war where the hegemonic power doesn't accept the rise of a new power, meaning China. So it's a kind of all-out war. It's not only trade war, it's of course, and it's even more important technological. There's even some kind of blockade vis-a-vis China. There's also a political dimension, and we can see that, and even military, even, well, if it's not really a war, but in the South China Sea. And there is an ideological dimension, because most of the time we say it's not a Cold War because it's very different to the Cold War between Soviet Union and the US and the Western world, well, for many reasons, but there is some ideologies on it. And it comes from us. I mean, promoting democracy, human rights, and so on. And the intention of Joe Biden saying America is back. And now we will promote our value and asking the Europeans to follow the American leadership. And that's where the EU needs to have a response. So, as it has been said, I think we can't just, well, it's not really equidistance, of course, because we are probably closer to the US than we are to the Chinese. But at the same time, we should stand on the line and decide on the basis of our interest, on the basis also of the relative power we have, because when the Chinese decide to punish the Europeans, generally the price is higher for us than it is for the US. I had many examples of that when I was ambassador in China, and we need to keep a cooperation with China, obviously. While it has been mentioned on some issues such as climate change, but probably on health issues. And of course, our companies will still be interested in the biggest market in the world. And by the way, the Americans also, because Tesla opened a gigafactory in Shanghai, and General Motors is selling more cars in China than in the US. And it's not only our companies of luxury who are interested by the market, or not only the German automotive industry, but I think for all our companies, sometimes we are more present on the Chinese market than in the American market. And so we have to take decisions really based on our interests. So there are all the tools which have been mentioned by Pascal, of course, and I would have one, which is the euro, because I think it is very important. The Chinese, as well as the Russians, decided to keep 25% of their reserves in euros, and it's also for political reasons, not only for economic reasons, and it's also in order to avoid extraterritorial sanctions. So again, if we decide to follow the Americans now, we won't have any choice in the future. So that's the reason why it's important to stay independent on that. On the geopolitical issues, I think, well, it's not so important to send warships in the region, because compared with the Americans, we have nothing in reality, and even the French, or well, out of the EU, the British. I think it is important to develop relationship with other countries, but not necessarily only to contain China. It's important because in the past, we decided only to focus on China, and we didn't pay attention to other countries, such as India, for instance. But when we do it, we should do it on proper motives, and not only to contain China. And it's not only to say that it is important, because that's what we've been saying for many years. But when there was meetings between Asian countries, ASEAN, for instance, and EU countries, the Asian ministers all came, and the EU ministers didn't even show up. So that's important also to pay respects to this country of the Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific region, if we want. What is important also is to keep our own house in order, because otherwise, it's very difficult to be considered as an example. And we know it if we refer to human rights issues. And for instance, we have the problem of Poland, we have the problem of Hungary, we have the problem of Slovenia as well. So lecturing as a country is a bit difficult. I think it is important when we consider the rights we want to defend, human rights, universal human rights. I think we're entitled to do that, and we can do it not necessarily taking sanctions, because there are counter-sanctions and there are escalation, and then it's afterwards it's a total disaster, and we are blocked. And it is the case for the CAI, this agreement on investments, because we are in a totally absurd situation, where there was some concessions from China when they accepted to open their market, and that's concessions already that the Americans already get with the first phase agreement, and now we've decided to freeze it because of this escalation and this question of sanctions. In the past, we had what we called sticks and carrots, and now we appear generally only to have sticks, and they're not necessarily very efficient. So I think, again, we can say that we're concerned with those questions of the Uyghurs, of the situation in Hong Kong as well, but we have to think about the tool of sanctions. It's most of the time not only not effective because they're not going to change their position, but hearing that regularly, they have to be more on a defensive position. That's what we're seeing with the Uyghur, because they try to explain that there's no camps, there's no forced labor, etc. So doesn't mean we don't have to mention it, but we have to consider the tools. And the last point, which is more about geopolitics, there is also a very important instrument, and we could follow this example, that is Galileo. Galileo is a very interesting example, because when we started to launch it, I remember that the Americans said, if the Europeans try to launch those satellites, we will just fire at them, and it's not acceptable. Finally, we have it. It's better than GPS. The Chinese wanted to be part of it. Now they decided to create their own one, which is Beidou. But I think on technology, on artificial intelligence, it's very important, and I think it's the absolute priority for the EU. We will be respected if we are stronger in these fields, and we will be respected in Washington as well as in Beijing. And that's true that for the time being, everybody is talking of course of a G2, but also of a triangle, because everybody is asking, referring to this China-US rivalry, where is Europe? What is Europe going to do? And so we have to be stronger, more resilient, more sovereign, etc., etc., as it has said by.
Great, thank you very much, Sylvie. Paolo.
Yes, thank you very much. I agree with what has been already said about the big shifts in the international economic and political system. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, the world economy had been profoundly changed over recent years due to the decline of the multilateral order, the deterioration of the global interdependence, and the great power rivalry between the United States and China. Now, confronting this new global context, Europe risks suffering great damage, there's no doubt. And in particular, confronting the possible degeneration of the US-China conflict. So I think the EU has every interest in trying to avoid any further weaponization of international economic relations. So in this perspective, I think Europe should try to upgrade a global role in terms of what has been said, is so-called the open strategic autonomy. But this is not just to impose, an Europe first strategy by pursuing the illusory climb of a European nationalism or an unsustainable equidistance between the two superpowers. That is not at all, should be the goal. The goal should be to relaunch the transatlantic relationship and for Europe to become the promoter of a sort of new multilateralism initiative, to be able to influence the negotiation on global public goods, involving China into this kind of negotiation, global public goods as climate change and digital governance. And of course, also to avoid any kind of beggar-thy-neighbor policy in areas such as trade and finance. So in concrete policy terms, of course, an open strategic autonomy initiative could mean many things. But I just limit for question of time to mentioning three broad economic policy initiatives and priority that I think is worth to indicate. The first priority is, of course, how to manage relation with the US and with China for maintaining an international trade openness, because that is the vital interest of the European economy. And there's no doubt that in order to manage this relation, a kind of broader and more effective EU foreign economic strategy is needed. What is required, in terms of transatlantic relation, is very clear that the Biden presidency does not mean that the US-EU relationship could go back to how it used to be, but it does offer Europe an opportunity to relaunch bilateral relations. I should say that so far, particularly on trade, this opportunity has not been very clear. In other words, we have very poor signs so far of what this is possible to achieve. But the Airbus Boeing kind of that is not a deal, as you know. No, is an option. Could be an encouraging first step. But certainly, many things should happen in order to trying to relaunch this kind of relationship. But of course, the relationship with China is going to become dominant over the next year. And, in this area, we need, of course, to coordinate with the US to face the new assertiveness of China. But I agree with what has been said, that the EU should have their own policy and maintain a relative autonomy, since European strategic and economic interests do not always coincide with the American ones. So it's true that US and Europe both share the view that relation with China should be based on, three broad principles. First, the necessity of cooperation on global issues. Secondly, the reality of economic competition. And the third, the need to speak openly about differences in value between our democratic country and China. But what is today missing is a consensus on where the balance should be struck, because it's very clear that there are different positions. The US administration so far is for conflict wherever possible and cooperation only where necessary. And I think Europe is, in different front. Europe is for cooperation wherever possible and conflict only where is necessary, is needed. Therefore, I think a compromise should be fine. In other words, is needed. It could be helpful. How to, in some way, to find a kind of more closeness in this respect. And it's very clear that to promote an open global trading system that is still, a priority for the European economy, it would be necessary to retain the strong, sophisticated trading bilateral relation network of the EU with the rest of the world. That has been the case for Europe in the recent years. In fact, defending a multilateral trading system does not in any way exclude more effective policy and strategy in bilateral negotiation. I think that's as was, in the past very clear. There is a second priority that I think is worth mentioning, and it is stemming from the need of reconnecting the domestic and global agenda of the EU strategic autonomy. And this second priority means that EU will have to reconfigure the growth model that has been pursued in the last decade, the so-called export growth model. As we know, this model was based on enormous trade surpluses with the rest of the world. And these surpluses will no longer be sustainable in the new world economic context. And what even more important, these surpluses are going to be a source of vulnerability in the medium long term. So an opportunity to take a kind of steps in the direction of a growth strategy based on more on a domestic demand will be offered by the investment that are needed to the next generation EU program, to the Green Deal, to the digitalization of the European economy. So I think in this perspective, the single market could become, it could provide more indigenous sources of growth, unlike what happened in the past. And this, I think, is important, even more, in the fact that this is the context that is very important in order to pursue the completion of the European Monetary Union. This completion is essential to favor what has been said, is very important, the international role of the euro of the medium term. And this is going to be crucial in order to increase the weight of the European Union on a global economy. So the second priority, this more domestic oriented growth strategy, and it does not mean that exports are not important. What should not be so important as in the past should be net export. That is a different story. And thirdly, for a large country or an area like the EU, the credibility of a more assertive foreign economic policy of an open strategic autonomy is not sustainable in the medium term without a strong technological competitive economy that can support it. So I think I agree that it's necessary to reduce the widening technological gap with the US and China, particularly regarding the technology of the fourth industrial revolution. And this is, is a necessity first to increase, how to increase the EU innovation capability. And of course, this means all the things that has been already said about defensive and, a policy in terms of trade, industry, technology, but also very much in terms of, trying to better coordinating this kind of policy at the European level. So let me conclude saying that, this kind of a more autonomous foreign economic policy must be based on greater unity among member states. And if we look at the past, the major obstacle have been the internal division within the EU. That was the problem, many years. And also the opportunity for China many times to exploit this division. So, we know that there are many, many causes of these divisions, as well known, but I think an important step could be to set up an EU effective common decision-making, mechanism and a sort of common capability as soon as possible. From this point of view, that could be a kind of very concrete step in the right direction. But I want to stop here and not to take longer. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. On that subject, I'm afraid at this point I'm going to have to start being slightly mean and say we are already predictably running behind time. So if people could keep their remarks as short as possible. Christian, you're the first person who I'm inviting to keep your remarks as short as possible. Will be the discussant on these two papers, an expert for globalization at Bertelsmann Stiftung. Christian.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here. I was a student both in France and Italy. I follow still the debates of the two countries. I wrote my book, EU Trade Strategy for the Age of Geoeconomic Globalization in Italy. So I'm delighted to be in this context. Before I come to these two very interesting papers that I've read with great interest and which I think really make a lot of very important points, I'd like to take a tiny step back and think about the big trends that we should take into account when thinking about strategic autonomy. So one we've already talked about at length, that is that the US-China rivalry will become a structuring force in foreign policy. The second we have touched upon, it's that the nature of globalization is changing. It is evolving from what you might like to call a more liberal, rules-based type of globalization to one that is more driven by geoeconomic considerations, by the building of dependencies or the evasion of dependencies. And that has important repercussions because it forces us to think about economic policy, trade policy, and foreign policy much more together rather than as to think of them as separate items. And the third point we haven't really touched upon at all, which is that the EU is a diminishing power. It is certainly so in demographic terms, but it is also so, although less than in demographic terms, in economic terms in the future. And that also, of course, affects our geoeconomic power or our bargaining power, if you want to put it like that. So I've already said there's much in these papers that I absolutely agree with. I think it's totally right for the EU to gradually develop more capabilities in terms of foreign and geoeconomic, geostrategic policies. It's about time that we do that we develop our own capabilities, that we strengthen our decision-making mechanisms in order to become much more credible, that we actually undertake an exercise of really finding out, okay, what is our interest and what is our strategy and how do we do this as member states together? I totally agree. I think, and this is a very central point, I mean, the EU is probably benefiting more from the liberal rules-based type of globalization than anyone else. So it absolutely makes sense that it is a centerpiece of our strategy that we invest in multilateralism and in the safeguarding of this kind of globalization that we appreciate so much and that we benefit from. I also believe in terms of developing capabilities, yes, we should also do what we can to develop our home market. I think that's a policy tool that is maybe not been at the fore over the last years, and where we can definitely do things, not only to have capabilities, but also to improve our bargaining power in an international comparison. We also need to urgently step up our game when it comes to innovation policy, because we do have a widening gap with the US and China, and that's a vital point as well. Nevertheless, there is sort of one consideration that I felt was maybe a bit missing in these papers, because what the papers do is that they suggest first-based policies, and that's absolutely right. I mean, who wouldn't go for first best if you can have it? But I'm not sure if we can have first best. Maybe we need to think about second best. What I mean with this, there are constraints on our foreign and geoeconomic policies that are there, and I don't see how we get around those in the short to medium term. Most notably, our way of making decisions. We are only to some point credible as a foreign policy actor. It is too easy to place divide and rule tactics on the European Union. And unless we change that, and I think it will not even be changed if by miracle overnight we had qualified majority voting on foreign policy issues. I think that has to be a much more deep reform of EU foreign policy in order to be the credible actor. We need to think, how can we ensure ourselves against divide and rule tactics? How can we make sure that we are taken seriously despite our shortcomings? And well, what are the alliances that help us? And this is the moment where I really advocate a stronger partnership with the US, because I think the US has actually an important role to play. First of all, it would be a partnership based on principle, which I think is really an important point. The US has lots of technological capabilities. It is maybe still the more important market to us than the Chinese market. So I think those are also arguments that tie us much closer to the US than to a position that is sort of trying to navigate a way in the middle. And last but not least, the US has the ability more than any EU member state to whip EU member states into line. That also is an important element to make a foreign policy and an alliance credible. I have much more to say, and I wished, I mean, I could comment in much more detail on the papers that the authors have written.
Thank you very much. I'm sure this issue of EU unity, which I'm very interested in as well, I'm sure that's something you can pick up later in the Q&A. But now on to the second set of papers from Elvia and Fabrizio, but on the economic part of it, on the role of global value chains and the threats to global value chains from COVID and from geopolitics, and how the EU can ensure strategic autonomy there. Elvia.
Thank you, Alan. Well, obviously, the pandemic has been really a wake-up call concerning the vulnerabilities linked to just-in-time. And now the resilience of supply chains is really becoming a pillar of this new thinking about open strategic autonomy. But in a way, I think, I mean, resilience of supply chain is not a new issue for business. Business has always tried to ensure that to limit the risk linked to its supply. It's really the new geopolitical framework which is amplifying the issue, with the risk to be entrapped into increasing, with the rivalry between the US and China, with increasing use of export bans, retaliation measures, which could interfere with the business strategy, and which is raising a new questions for states to ensure the national supply of the national consumers, be it at the national level or at the European level, which is a much more complex issue. And I think that it's particularly interesting to have this discussion now that we've been through more than 1 year of heated debate, as Alan said, a very theological debate about open strategic autonomy, and to see what's the balance that we're finding at the moment between the role of business, the role of public intervention, and the expectation of public opinion, because I think that we have to take into account also this factor and the risk of more tensions between expectation from public opinion and the economic reality. And how are we dealing with the tensions of initiatives allowing to create an ecosystem facilitating the increased resilience of supply chains, or heading towards the possibility of more interference into the management of business. One first comment would be to keep in mind that the EU remains an intra-EU regional power, but that this intra-trade is really shrinking to the benefits of increasing share of foreign added value in EU productions, and more specifically to the benefit of China. This is nothing new, but this is happening at the moment where global value chains have started already to shrink since 2012. So this is not recent. It happened really before COVID period, and this is increasing really the regionalization of supply chains already. But the EU itself is being more dependent on foreign added value. The second element is something that Pascal Lamy already mentioned, but the inertia of strong discrepancies between member states linked to the structure of the economy, to the importance of the industrial sector in the GDP, has created some strong mistrust between member states that seems to be more sticky than the reality of initiatives really taken at the level of the member states. And that we see that in the exchange of letters that was addressed to von der Leyen at the beginning of in March, we have seen different grouping of countries proposing different interpretation of economic sovereignty, which in the end didn't seem so far away from each other, but which says something about the mistrust that they have towards the potential, notably the potential interest for more protectionist approach. And obviously, when I say that, we can have in mind that France was precisely pointed at. And that a recent poll in France was indicating that 76% of French public opinion was more in favor of reshoring. So it says something about the expectation that are particularly strong in some member states, and about the fear from notably from Northern Europe that there could be some more protectionist approach in countries like France or like others. Having said that, I think that the overall assessment of the reactions of business towards the problems of disruption is that business has shown a very strong capacity of resilience, and in a way the problems that we faced during the COVID crisis has been, and notably at the beginning of the COVID crisis, has been more a problem of robustness, a problem to continue operating while they were faced with disruption, rather than recover from disruptions, and that those problems of robustness were really specific to certain sectors. Of course, we think about the PPE trade issues, but that they were more caused by a global demand, a shock of global demand, but that the business itself overall has recovered and has demonstrated quite a strong capacity of resilience, and that what the recent polls are showing is that business is answering towards those problems of resilience with more willingness first to increase stockpiling, then to diversify. And then in the end, very small percentage of business is really heading toward relocation, a relocation which would mean more onshoring, reshoring to the home country. But stockpiling is costly. Diversification has its limits also because it is as well costly, and there's not always so much capacity to diversify, and there are problems of concentration of suppliers. And that's those strategies that are put in place by business are addressing the problems related to the first tier supplier, but they're lacking the more systemic approach of resilience of supply chains, and they're lacking sometimes to respond to the weaknesses linked to second or third tier supplier. And we know that supply chains are as strong as their weakest link. And that means that there's a need for a more systemic approach to the resilience of supply chains. And that opens more leeway for more cooperative approach between business and maybe public support to increase the ecosystem to facilitate the resilience of supply chains. One first element would be to work on the knowledge of strategic dependencies. It is a key step, and it's not only Europeans who are working on that. We have seen that the Biden administration has just recently delivered its first assessment concerning 4 strategic sectors. The European Commission has put forward quite quickly since the request from the last October Council conclusions. Its first assessment of strategic dependencies, and the results are already very interesting. But we very quickly see that we will need to have a more granular approach to those dependencies, with more analysis of the components of products and where they are coming from, and more specific what is the overall dependency to some countries, and of course to China. And that will request more cooperation with business to be able to use more data coming from business. Of course, there's a strong mistrust and a strong reluctance from business to provide some strategic data, and they will need to build up some infrastructure and standards and guidelines to be able to have that more that pooling of information, to have that sort of bird view of supply chains, of strategic dependencies. Another priority would be the support to the European Commission level playing field agenda. That was again mentioned already extensively by Pascal Lamy, all the different initiatives that are already in the pipeline put forward by the European Commission, but the agenda is quite overloaded, and we will need to have an active support from the member state to speed that agenda, which is what I would qualify less than a defensive agenda. In a way, is a first step to build up an offensive agenda to increase competitive neutrality with some competitors, which with whom we more increasing trade distortion could create more asymmetries in trade and more vulnerabilities in supply. I'm already too long, so I will only mention 1 or 2 elements, but in the way we use even those autonomous instruments, there could be a more specific attention to the criteria of resilience of supply chains, thinking about foreign direct investment screening, the tool that has been implemented last October. We already see that there could be a use, more flexible use, departing from only national security matters towards a more a more flexible understanding of economic security issues to control more the investment that could create some weaknesses in supply chains. And the way we will use the future instruments in concerning reciprocity in public procurement could also be a key issue. Concerning the multilateral level, I think I would add to the already full agenda of reform that Europeans are supporting for reform of WTO, and an issue about raw material and the necessity to engage into a discussion about potentially considering some raw material as a global public good, and the way we could frame a sort of regulation of access to certain key raw material who might have a decisive impact in terms of competition and development of technological capacities in the future, and which have the potential to create really huge imbalances between countries. I'll stop there just by concluding that I think that all those debates, first of all, information about the reality of vulnerabilities and initiatives that are taken really should be more extensively presented into the public debate to avoid a sort of decoupling between public opinion really expecting much more public intervention, and particularly at the moment when we continue to need building more legitimacy to an offensive.
Thank you very much. Okay, before I go on, given where we are on time, I think pretty much all of our QA will have to be online. If you look at the Q&A, several questions open. I'd encourage all of the speakers and the discussants to look there and see if there's any that you might fancy answering, since we'll have, I think, none or very little time to do it live. The final presenter today is Fabrizio.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'm glad for this opportunity to share with you some of the findings of this joint paper with Cristina Castelli and Giulio Giangasper of the Italian Trade Agency. Our work focused on an Italian perspective on global value chain resilience and sustainability in the framework of this strategy, Open Strategic Autonomy. As already mentioned by Elvira, promoting resilience and sustainability of supply chains is one of the three pillars of the EU path towards open strategic autonomy. And despite the Commission common emphasis on the rule-based trading system, on developing cooperative mechanism to facilitate access to the critical supplies, European policy discussions so far also address the role of other potentially more assertive and restrictive policy options, such, for example, investment screening mechanism, security of supply related measures, such as, for example, subsidies or tax incentives to companies for local production. These are the sort of measures that might affect potentially companies' decision to relocate offshore production and more generally the reconfiguration of global value chains. How relevant are these processes of supply chains shortening and restructuring in the pursuit of strategic autonomy? And given the current degree of specialization and participation to international production network, what are the potential, if any, for reshoring? We tried somehow to reply to this question by exploring some recent empirical evidence focused on the role of Italy international production actors, but not only, not exclusively. And also we looked at the resilience of corresponding supply chains, and we tried to identify some preliminary recommendation on some alternative trade policy options for possible implementation of the EU Open Strategic Autonomy model in search of this resilience and sustainability of global value chains. So I'll just go straight to the preliminary findings that we explored. So according to this available, very recent evidence concerning Italy, and also, as I said, other EU member states, first of all, the reorganization of international production networks do not seem to be neither efficient nor a priority for companies. We looked at that by exploring the OECD data, for example, the IDA, on trade in intermediate processed goods and on trade in value added. And in a way, coherently with consolidated evidence in economic literature, international production networks have mainly a regional character. And Italy shows a remarkable integration with the EU and with other countries of the European area. If we look at data on exports of manufacturing in terms of value added, that value added origins to a large extent, it's almost 90% from Italy, the EU, and some other European countries. All of them except Russia are linked to the EU by preferential trade agreements, also to say that. So, moreover, these trends appear to be also substantially in line with other results. For example, there are multiple case studies carried out by the Italian Trade Agency in 2018, involving 48 companies based in Italy. And that trends clearly consolidated with lead companies involved in the survey confirming that parts and components are sourced mainly in the European region. If we look at other recent analysis and surveys on Italian firms, we can see useful converging evidence on resilience of international production network. A first survey, one carried out by the Bank of Italy at the end of 2020, shows that most firms are not considering at all reconfiguration of global value chains. They did not radically change their choices about location of their plants, about foreign suppliers, and most importantly, they could not change their strategy in the future, despite eventually substantial losses in turnover. Same data we will look at in the Italian National Statistics Institute, but let me go to the other finding that's really consolidated in the recent evidence. Companies involved in global value chains appear to have dealt better vis-a-vis to domestic firms with respect to the crisis. We've seen this in the Bank of Italy survey I was mentioned before, with Italian internationalized companies that deal really better with the crisis than those operating on the internal markets. And this sheltering function of participation to global value chains is also highlighted in World Bank data, COVID-19 surveys on Italy, but also in the case studies collected by the Italian Trade Agency. Also a McKinsey report published in 2020. According to a simulation carried out by the OECD this year in 2021, a generalized relocation of production within countries is unlikely to result in increased stability of supply. Of course, not all stages of production can be undertaken in the own country. And not only this, when a shock occurs, domestic economy appear to be vulnerable to shocks due to the lack of an external adjustment channel. This implies, for the European policymaking point of view, that it is necessary to keep markets open and facilitate cross-border investment. And that also there's a large scope for trade policy to support global value chains resilience and sustainability by tackling at the border and beyond border issues at all decision level, from national to multilateral level. We try to identify some alternative options for EU trade policy in order to improve risk management. Trade policy at the EU level should facilitate firms to diversify their suppliers and to build up redundancy, as we were saying also before. It appears very important to keep tariffs on intermediate goods at low level and reduce non-tariff barriers. By speaking about non-tariff barriers, an important step for trade facilitation would be to move towards an harmonization of rule of origin, but also to enhance harmonization of both preferential and non-preferential rules in order to converge to a core principle possible through plurilateral initiatives. Also important, promoting the harmonization of technical standards and the mutual recognition of conformity assessment. This is much true in a world of fragmented production processes. Facilitating international trade in services. We all know the high shares, 1/3 of the value added containing exported manufacturing goods is related to services. So it is important that at supranational level, the EU should promote the assumption of the trade and service agreement, and European countries could support a new round with the aim of focusing on social and sustainability priorities in line with the principles that are outlined in the EU Open Strategic Autonomy. Moreover, all the assumption on the positive impact on firm performance and economic resilience of digital technologies have been confirmed by the pandemic. So in terms of trade policy, the EU should also back the adoption of a plurilateral treaty on e-commerce, and EU should improve market access to also bilateral and regional agreements by choosing to deepen e-trade liberalization and granting EU interests and values. Let me go to the final point. Also, preferential trade agreement. These can play an important role in setting standards for protecting the environment and human rights by promoting those European values and affirming the EU assertiveness and strategic autonomy. Go back to you, Alan. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you very much. And the discussant for the second set of papers is Mallory Schaus, who's the coordinator of the Task Force on Industrial Strategy here in Brussels at the CEPS think tank. Mallory.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation, the very interesting reading and webinar. So diversification of supply chains with public support and enhance attractiveness of the single market by ensuring a level playing field are the common claims of both papers to achieve the resilience of supply chains. Both papers' approach, founded in economics and embedded in regulatory and principle-based thinking, represents an important guide for the better understanding of this overarching nebulous concept of open strategic autonomy. Where the first paper at the very start qualifies open strategic autonomy as an oxymoron, I would rather say that both papers actually reveal through their findings that this is not really the case with resilience. Openness is compatible, may coexist with some autonomy. And this is supported by the traditional openness of the EU to trade and investment and the very essence of economics-based international trade policy and law that generally implies with trade openness, the recognition of some form of autonomy. Be it here in the papers, regulatory autonomy for precautionary reasons with respect to sustainability or greater assertiveness against unfair trade practices. Everything is, of course, a question of degree and approach. Turning now to the proposed priorities for increasing the resilience of supply chains. The modernization of WTO rules, as claimed in both papers, has indeed to be favored for ensuring security predictability of the rules-based multilateral trading system, and thereby also contributing to peace. The approach should be at best multilateral, but it will most probably be a plurilateral approach, as underlined in the paper of Fabrizio Botti. In that regard, it's important to emphasize, as done in the paper of Elvire Fabry, that the EU endorses a strategic role, a role of the broker, and I would even say, to refer to a renewed EU concept, the role of peace mediator, based on the EU's regulatory power surplus. And here I'm actually referring to a recent paper by Ignacio Garcia Berquero and Calypso Nicolaidis, where both authors argue that the EU, as a trade power with well-established policies anchored in a framework of rules-based governance, has played a decisive role in the development of global trade governance and should continue so as a responsible power with normatively clear goals and active cooperation policies. And this is generally underlined in both papers. Turning now to 3 points. The monitoring of dependencies. The paper of Elvire Fabry refers to the need for business data. The paper could, in this perspective, perhaps also refer to the forthcoming Commission's proposal on due diligence, mandatory due diligence with respect to human rights and environmental protection, which may represent an interesting laboratory for data collection with respect to sustainability and thereby also resilience of supply chains, based on a whole ecosystem which involves reporting, monitoring, and a complaint system. And beyond this proposal on due diligence is aimed at establishing a level playing field and thus contributing to the attractiveness of the single market and its resilience. On the paper of Elvire Fabry concerning the integration of resilience of supply chain as part of the member state screening of FDIs, it's a very interesting idea that I think would not go against the public security purpose of FDI screening. Nevertheless, to overcome the limitations of the current cooperation mechanism between the member states and the Commission, an EU-wide investment screening mechanism with respect to at least projects of union interest should be established, and this mechanism could then integrate the focus on the resilience of supply chain. I would like also to refer to both papers' emphasis on the importance of pursuing the negotiation of FTAs. The paper of Fabrizio Botti refers to this for sustainability reasons, and the paper of Elvire Fabry refers to this in contrast to the current focus by the Commission on implementation of existing FTAs. And in this respect, it's however important to underline that the Commission's current focus on implementation may be explained by the fact that the system seems to be stalled, and therefore the question as to what type of FTA should be favored is important. Should we continue with trade and sustainable development chapters in those FTAs, and how? And in this slide, the proposal in the paper of Fabrizio Botti to negotiate a WTO agreement on environmental goods and services should be favored. So after all these comments, I would have a final question. The enhanced resilience and sustainability of supply chains, which are embedded in a broader economic paradigm shift towards inclusiveness, will entail increased costs, even though perhaps more limited compared to reshoring. The first paper questions whether European consumers would be ready or even able to pay higher prices. So my question to you, how are we going to tackle this problem through a general race to the top? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, we have almost, in fact, we have minus time for questions, but let me just take a minute or two for each pair of speakers. First, I think for Sylvie and Paolo, let me pick up something that Christian said and something that I thought as well, which is about the unity of member states and the ability of the EU to act collectively, which I think was mentioned in Paolo's paper. In the last 48 hours in Brussels, literally, you have seen the member states completely at odds on how to deal with Russia and Vladimir Putin. The EU-China investment deal that Sylvie mentioned was obviously one where member states were also at odds with each other, let alone with the European Parliament. Unless there's going to be some institutional change, like QMV for foreign policy, how do you build a single EU view on geopolitics, which can then be transmitted through whatever instruments you have in order to actually build strategic autonomy? And as I say, please, if you could do this in a quick 5 minutes or so, that would be great.
Well, it's mission impossible. I think it's very difficult. And if you compare China with Russia, China was easier than Russia in the past because, well, for certain historic reasons, well, the Poles, the Baltic countries, and so on are very adamant against Russia. So it was very difficult to keep a common line. So we thought in the past that it was easier with China, but it's the contrary now. It's also very difficult. I'm in favor of QNV in foreign and security policy, but for the time being, it's impossible. So I think we should agree on some principles more than on precise issues, because it will be very difficult. And that's the same because it has been mentioned about cooperation with the Americans. I think we should have a cooperation with the Americans on the principles level playing field, more transparent behavior of the Chinese, and the openness of the market. But frankly, I can't really answer your question about the unity of the union. We should tend to have this unity, but it's very, very difficult.
Paolo, you're on mute. You're on mute. You're still on mute.
I totally agree with the mission impossible or very difficult. But let me say that there is one kind of area, and it has been raised by Ricardo Perisic on the question. One kind of area where the cohesion or the unity of the EU is going to be tested. That this is going to be the confrontation on technological issue and technology with China. I think that could be a kind of area where this kind of not so much in terms of common decision mechanism or instrument, but on key issue like the kind of agreement with the US in terms of regulation, in terms of digital kind of standard and so on. This kind of area could offer an opportunity to form this kind of united front, because here the distance, the difference, and the kind of challenge is so high that probably could be the one chance to transform this impossible mission in some kind of more affordable kind of target.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, very quickly, Hervé and Fabrizio, if you could just answer, I wonder if you could address Mallory's question, which is, these things have costs. Diversifying has costs, building multiple supply chains has costs. Are people really prepared to, when it comes to it, when they start to see the costs, are people prepared to pay it?
It's a very concrete question, because and the question is raised at the moment when we will see that the cost of the COVID crisis will come to the front. So there's a convergence of cost for the consumers. I think precisely that the issue is also raised for the greening of the economy, and that really raises a question about new behaviors of consumers, and also the capacity of business really to hold the cost of this increase. Precautionism that will be applied in different sectors. But if they are to ask the consumer to hold this charge, I think we will be entering into a more pragmatic approach of resilience, and for the moment we're still in the phase of the more political debate.
Fabrizio, finally.
Yeah, Alan and Mallory, it's a very interesting and difficult question to reply. As in the evidence we try to present today, we don't see in the short, medium term a radical shift in companies' decision to relocate or to restructuring their supply chains where they are. So I don't see this loss of efficiency that may be a markup on prices, and so a difficult decision for consumers in the medium and short term. Possibly, company will be forced to diversify by complying with standards in terms of environmental standards and labor rights standards. These could be the kind of requirements that may change companies' decision in terms of location of their plants, selection of their suppliers. And agree with Elvire, this is a very political reply that we need. There's a role of the state in terms of incentives for companies and subsidization that we need to shape. And I really believe that at the European level, we can do something important at this stage. I mean, I see the European Union as a driver, as a leader in setting standards in terms of role of the state in advancing in terms of new standards for respecting the environment and the rights and consequences, prices for consumers.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. So that's all the time we have for questions. So just to close the conference, thank you all for coming. Thank you all for attending. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. At this stage of the conference, no one wants to hear final remarks, really. So I'll try to be as quick as I can. We started our conversation asking ourselves, what do we mean by open strategic autonomy? And my answer is, I don't know. The answer I get immediately comes to my mind is that we are witnessing an historical phase where the state is back. The state is back for two reasons. One, of course, is the COVID crisis, which is unprecedented in its extension and gravity and shape, but also relates to the fact that previous to the COVID crisis, the global economy was in trouble, was getting some fatigue. Let me be a bit ironic on that. So we are facing a situation in which policy is needed more than before. And of course, when we talk about policy, we're talking about the state. So the state in the global environment, which has always been a fascinating topic. It's a fascinating topic to me, for instance, because it highlights a lot of interconnections in which are sometimes kept apart for the benefit of being as clear as one can, but they're not really separated in reality. They're closely interconnected. So recognizing this makes it more difficult for state analysis to go on. So what those three words mean to me in international environment? First of all, strategic. It means that you have to interact with your partners, neighbors, hostiles, friends, allies, whatever. You cannot go alone, because either you're too big to avoid making noise with your neighbors, or too small that you cannot avoid the impact of what others do to you. So you need to take into account strategy. This sounds obvious, but it makes a lot of difference. So secondly, open strategic environment means to me that when we talk about one policy area, we're actually talking about all the issue linkages we can think of. We have been discussing a lot about trade, but we all know that if we go global, we need to, of course, take a look at investment, technology, regulation, security, and all of these things generate issue linkages, which may be crucial to ultimately determining whether you reach a cooperative agreement or you don't, whether you govern the production of global public goods or you don't. So if it's open, it means it's multidimensional. And finally, there is autonomy, which ultimately to me means that at some stage, countries can decide to walk out. They can walk out peacefully, they can walk out more aggressively, but they can decide that the international agreements they've been inside for some time are no longer viable. So this is my first point. Second point, which is basic international economics to me. There is the way macroeconomic policy interact in an open economy is always determined by what the traditional economists call a payment regime, exchange rates, investment, capital mobility, and so forth. Why am I mentioning this? Because I have a very simple point to remind ourselves. All of these systems, more or less, have had an interesting life, but a limited life. The post-war example of this is, of course, Bretton Woods, which was based on the ruins of the Second World War, and eventually provided a period of prosperity to a number of countries, the advanced countries, which were at that stage not so advanced, but then eventually collapsed for reasons that are all of us recall very well. This is a story which has been repeated itself when we bring China into the picture. Again, China, like the Bretton Woods system, was given a boost because of trade policy, of openness of their markets, which eventually, however, proved to be generating instability as much as the Bretton Woods Mark I provided, so much that you may recall some literature of the early 2000s, the topic of which was Bretton Woods II, where China took the place of what was Europe in the post-war period to provide supply for consumer demand in the rich country, the United States, while the rich country could afford, because of a number of reasons, not to pay for those imports. And this made the system unsustainable, much like the Bretton Woods I was unsustainable. Why am I recalling this? Because we are now, and I'm about to conclude my simple thoughts, where we are now is a situation in which we have to ask the question, what if there is a new international regime coming up, and where is Europe going to be? It is interesting to note that during the Bretton Woods II period, which was about at the beginning of this century, Europe did not do much. In the early 2000s, the debate about global economic policy always highlighted the role of the United States and China as adversaries, and the role of Europe as a bystander, which was reflected in the fact that Europe had stopped growing while China was growing because of an export-led model, and the United States were growing because of a domestic demand-led model. As Paolo Guerrieri reminded us, this eventually proved to be unsustainable. So where do we go from there? Can we still afford to have a ultimately unsustainable global system, or should we do something about it? Well, of course, we have to do something about it. And one thing that we need to do is to move away conceptually and policy-wise from the idea that the only way to grow is through export-led growth. We in Europe need to come forward with a European-led growth, which exploits all the benefits of issue linkages, of technology, of innovation, of digital, and so forth. And now we are lucky enough to have a global crisis, which at least gathers some political consensus for doing that. This is a unique historical opportunity, which is tied up with at least in my view, the recognition that the way to build traditional macroeconomic global regimes would not work. And here I would add one final point, which was raised by Sylvie, if I'm not wrong, that we have now an additional weapon, the possible development of a global currency, which could prove to be a key element in organizing a new collective agreement, which would eventually bring to the production of global public goods. And the fact that Next Generation EU is providing the resources to all European countries according to what they need is a sign that we have financial capital, industrial capital, technological capital, and political capital. It may sound too optimistic, but I like to be an optimistic economist. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That's a really fascinating discussion. I'm not sure we've come up with a blueprint exactly as such to the degree put in place by Monday morning. The one thing, just to pick up Pierre Carlo's points, I think one thing we can be clear of is that there's the state of sort of extraordinary crisis and extraordinary flux, where all sorts of things become or ought to become possible that weren't before, if policymakers are bold enough to grasp them. And I think we can look back in maybe 2, 3, 5, 10 years and think, well, that was the moment to which Europe did seize or could have seized the opportunity fundamentally to remake itself. And we should be watching with great interest to see whether it does. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you all for your answers. Thank the panelists and thank the discussants. Have a good weekend. Thanks a lot.